I had 3 kids behind me and 1 garbage bag at my feet when my own parents closed the door in my face. My brother laughed from behind them. My sister gave me a lecture about choices. I picked up that bag, buckled my kids into the car, and whispered 3 words to nobody. Watch what happens. My name is Della Marsh. I am 36 years old and I live in a 3-bedroom apartment in a school district I chose deliberately, in a life I built from a motel room and a garbage bag and a promise made on a porch on a Tuesday night. But let me take you back 18 months, because none of what I have now makes any sense without understanding everything I walked through to get here. 18 months ago, I had what most people would have called a stable life. Not the kind that gets photographed and posted and turned into something aspirational, but stable in the specific way that actually matters. Predictable income, a house with a yard the kids fought over on summer evenings, a minivan that needed new brake pads but reliably started every morning. 3 children who were healthy and loud and growing so fast, I sometimes felt like I was trying to hold water in cupped hands, always slightly more of them spilling over the edges than I could manage to keep. My oldest, Nora, was 9 years old, the kind of child who reads instructions before opening anything. Cautious and precise and already watching the world with the attentiveness of someone who intends to understand it fully before committing to any particular response. My middle child, Poppy, was 6, loudly convinced that gravity was a suggestion rather than a law, and regularly attempting to test this theory on every elevated surface available to her. And my youngest, Finn, was 4, still small enough to fall asleep against my shoulder at the end of a long day, still young enough to believe with complete confidence that I could fix anything if I was simply given enough time and the right materials. I also had Marcus. We had been married for 11 years, long enough that I had stopped being able to clearly remember the version of myself that had existed before him, which is something nobody prepares you for in the early months of a marriage, the way a person can disappear gradually and completely into the shape of someone else's life without ever making a single conscious decision to do so. Marcus was not a cruel man. Cruelty would have been recognizable. Something I could have named and addressed and made a decision about. Marcus was charming and inconsistent and had a particular talent for making the distance between what he promised and what he delivered feel like a failure of my expectations rather than a failure of his follow-through. He was the kind of man who never raised his voice and yet somehow managed, consistently and without apparent effort, to make whatever had gone wrong feel like a deficiency in me that he was generously choosing not to press. The cracks in our marriage had been visible for years. I had become, over those years, an expert at spackling them, at finding the angle from which they were least noticeable and presenting that angle to myself and to everyone around me. I worked full-time as a patient services coordinator at a regional medical clinic. Not glamorous work, but steady and meaningful, and mine in the specific way that work is yours when you are good at it and know it. I managed the house, the children's school schedules, the pediatric appointments, the permission slips, the grocery runs, the birthday parties, the school projects, the nightmares at 2 a.m. Marcus managed his career, which he treated with the reverence and priority that some people reserve for religion. Regional sales manager at a distribution company. Good salary, long hours, frequent travel, and somewhere inside all those business trips and late conference calls, he had found someone else. I found out the way that a lot of women in my situation find out, not through a confrontation or a revelation or a moment of particular clarity, but through an accidental notification on a phone he left unlocked on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower. 4 sentences. That was all it took. 4 sentences in 11 years reorganized themselves in about 40 seconds into something I did not recognize and could not unsee. I will not describe in detail what the weeks that followed looked like, because some pain is too specific and too personal to spread across a public space. What I will tell you is that we tried, briefly and unsuccessfully, to hold things together. Marcus said the right things, the way he had always said the right things. But something in me had shifted permanently, and the words passed through me without landing, like wind through a screen door. By early spring, I had spoken to an attorney and begun the process of filing for divorce. What I had not anticipated, what I had not allowed myself to fully imagine, was what would happen when I told my family. I come from a family that I had always understood to be close. My parents, Renata and Harold, had been married for 38 years. They were the kind of parents who appeared at graduations and recitals without being reminded, who called on birthdays and remembered the names of their grandchildren's friends. My brother Garrett was 33, unmarried, living in the basement of my parents' house that he had converted into an elaborate gaming setup that he treated with more care and attention than most people give to small businesses. My sister Vivienne was 29, married 14 months, and in possession of the absolute certainty about relationships that 14 months of marriage sometimes produces in people who have not yet encountered the parts of it that are genuinely difficult. I called my mother first. I told her what had happened, what Marcus had done, that I had filed for divorce, that the house situation was unclear and could take months to resolve legally, and that I needed somewhere for me and the children to stay for a few weeks while things stabilized. Just a few weeks. The guest room, the basement, anything available. There was a pause on the line before she responded, the specific kind of pause that contains an entire conversation inside it. She said that they did not really have the space. I want you to understand something. My parents' house has 4 bedrooms. Garrett occupied one. 2 others sat empty. The finished basement had a pull-out sofa, a full bathroom, and a television, and I had slept down there every holiday for the past decade when evenings ran long. There was space. There was more than enough space. What there was not was willingness. My mother suggested I think more carefully about the divorce. She suggested that Marcus was a provider, and that these things happened in marriages, and that the stability of my children should take precedence over my personal feelings. My husband had been unfaithful. I had documentation. I had not misread or overreacted to the situation, and yet I was being counseled to reconsider. I drove to my parents' house the following morning anyway, because I needed to look my father in the face and ask him directly. I pulled into the driveway I had pulled into 1,000 times before, walked up the porch steps I had run up as a child, and knocked on the door. Harold answered. My father is not, or was not, a cold man. But he stood in the doorway with his face arranged into an expression that told me he had been briefed, that he had already decided what he was going to say, and had been waiting for the opportunity to say it. He told me that he and my mother had discussed it and did not think it was a good idea for me to stay there. I told him I had nowhere else to go while the legal process played out. He told me I could go back to Marcus and try again. Nora was standing directly behind me, 9 years old, completely silent. I felt her hand find mine, and I held it as tightly as I could without frightening her. I told my father I was not going back. I told him I was asking for help. He looked at me, and then passed me at the children, and then he stepped back slightly and said he was sorry and began to close the door. Garrett appeared behind him before it fully shut, leaned around our father's shoulder with the specific expression of someone who has decided their own comfort is the most important factor in every situation, and told me there literally was no space, that I knew how it was. He had an entire converted basement to himself. He knew exactly how it was. I stood on that porch and I did not cry. The feeling was there, pressing hard against the back of my throat. But Nora was holding my hand, and Poppy had pressed herself against my leg, and Finn had wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, because at 4 years old, he could feel that something serious was happening, even if the specifics were beyond him. I was not going to fall apart in front of them. Not there, not on that porch. Then Vivienne appeared. Of course she did. My sister materialized in the hallway behind my father, with her arms crossed and her head tilted in the particular way she had when she was preparing to deliver an opinion she had already decided was wisdom. She told me she thought the whole situation was a little impulsive. She said Marcus was not a bad person, that people made mistakes, that I had 3 children whose stability mattered more than my feelings right now. Their stability. As though I had not been the architect of every stable thing in their lives for the entirety of their existence. As though I had not been at every school pickup, every fever, every nightmare, every difficult morning and overwhelming evening. As though the stability she was concerned about had been built by anyone other than me. I thanked her for her input. My voice was extremely even. Vivian shrugged as though I was being unreasonably difficult. I picked up the garbage bag at my feet. I buckled 3 children into a minivan that needed new brake pads. And I drove away from the house I had grown up in, without looking back in the rearview mirror because I did not trust myself to look back and keep driving at the same time. We spent the first night in a motel 30 minutes outside of town. It cost more than I wanted it to cost. But it was clean and it had 2 beds, and the kids thought it was an adventure. Poppy announced she would sleep in the middle, because she was the most important. Nora helped me get Finn settled, and then quietly made sure her own things were organized for school the next morning, without being asked. I laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks, a small and slightly shaking laugh, but real. I lay awake after they were all asleep, and I made myself think not about what I had lost, but about what I had. A full-time position I could ask for at the clinic if I approached my supervisor correctly. A clean work history, an attorney who had agreed to a payment arrangement, 3 children who were healthy and currently asleep in a pile like small animals, and 3 words I had whispered to myself on a porch. I am going to skip over the harder parts of what followed, not because they were not real, but because this story is not fundamentally about suffering. There was enough of it. There were weeks in that motel that became a full month. There were evenings when I fed the children properly and ate crackers myself because I had used my last available cash on Finn's shoes after a growth spurt made his old ones unwearable, and I was not going to let him go to daycare in shoes that hurt his feet. There were nights I sat in the bathroom after the kids were asleep and allowed myself to feel the full unmanaged weight of what had happened and what I was carrying, and then I got up and washed my face and went back to being their mother, which was the one job I was not willing to do badly, regardless of how everything else was going. Stay with me, because what I built after those nights is the part of this story that I most want you to hear. My supervisor at the clinic was a woman named Teresa, direct and observant and unexpectedly kind, in the way of people who have been through their own difficult things, and came out of them with their capacity for empathy intact rather than depleted. She noticed that I had been arriving early and staying late for several weeks in a row, and she asked me one afternoon, without ceremony, whether I was in a difficult situation. I told her yes. She did not offer me pity or platitudes. She offered me hours. Full-time with benefits, effective immediately if I wanted it. I told her yes before she finished the sentence. I found an apartment 2 months after that conversation. 2 bedrooms, a neighborhood that was not fancy but was safe, within walking distance of Nora and Poppy's school, and 2 bus stops from Finn's daycare. The kitchen had 1 drawer that required a specific technique to open, and the bathroom had tiles in a shade of beige that had probably been considered modern at some point in the distant past, but it was ours. I hung curtains the first weekend we moved in. Poppy chose them, bright orange with small white flowers, aggressively cheerful, and I put them up and stood back and felt, for the first time in months, something that resembled a future taking shape. The divorce took 9 months from filing to finalization. Marcus had retained a more expensive attorney initially, and had used that advantage to propose a custody arrangement that reflected, generously interpreted, an optimistic vision of how present he intended to be going forward. But here is something I learned during that process that I want to pass on to anyone listening who is in a similar situation. Fathers who have not been doing the daily work of parenting do not have documentation of that work because it was never done. I had 11 years of being the primary parent recorded in school file ASACALDs, medical records, daycare sign-in sheets, pediatric appointment histories, and the detailed notes my own attorney had gathered during the custody evaluation. The evaluator's report was not kind to Marcus's characterization of his involvement. I was awarded primary physical custody. He received alternating weekends and 2 weeks during the summer. He also owed a retroactive child support amount covering the duration of the proceedings that his legal team attempted several creative approaches to reduce. None of those approaches were successful. My family learned about the settlement outcome through the specific mechanism of a small town where information moves faster than it should. My mother called me. It was the first time she had called since the conversation when I told her I was filing for divorce. She said she was so relieved it had all worked out, in the tone of someone who had been supportive throughout and was now sharing in the outcome of that support. I told her I was glad things had worked out. I did not elaborate. She shifted into a mode I recognized, the gentle suggestion that I was being oversensitive, that families went through difficult periods, that we all needed to move forward together. I let her finish. Then I told her I needed more time and that I would be in touch when I was ready. I have not rushed that timeline. Vivienne reached out 4 months after the settlement with a long message, several paragraphs, about reflection and reconnection and things that came out wrong and hoping I understood where she had been coming from. I read it twice. I thought about the porch and the specific tilt of her head when she told me my children's stability mattered more than my feelings. I wrote back something brief and not unkind. I told her I appreciated the message and that I needed more time and that I would reach out when I was ready. She has continued sending messages at regular intervals. They have become progressively more elaborate and progressively more aware that she made a calculation that did not account for who I was going to become. I read them. I take my time. Garrett has not reached out, which is its own kind of answer and one I have accepted without spending significant energy on. My father sent a card at Christmas with his handwriting inside, and I put it on the refrigerator for the children because it was their grandfather's handwriting, and that belongs in a separate category from everything else. 6 months after the settlement, Teresa recommended me for a team lead position that had opened in our department. The position came with a salary increase that made me sit down for a moment when I read the offer letter. Not because the number was extraordinary. It was a reasonable and appropriate number for the role and the responsibility. But because it was mine in the specific way that things are yours when you have earned them without anyone's charity or exception, documented and verifiable, and belonging entirely to the work you did and the person you became while you were doing it. I upgraded the apartment 8 months after that. 3 bedrooms, same school district, slightly newer building, a bathroom whose tiles were in a color that had never been fashionable in any recorded era of interior design history, but whose every drawer opened completely on the first attempt. Poppy immediately claimed the largest bedroom and covered one wall in chalk paint and filled it with drawings of horses rendered with great enthusiasm and limited technical accuracy but enormous commitment. Nora, who had been quiet and watchful through all of it, came to find me one evening while I was making dinner, leaned against the kitchen counter, watched me for a moment, and then said that she thought we were going to be okay. She was 10 by then. I told her I thought so too. She went back to her homework. I kept cooking and I thought about a porch and a garbage bag and 3 words. There is a particular kind of justice that does not arrive with a dramatic moment or a scene where you witness the exact expression on someone's face when they understand they were wrong. It is quieter than that, and it accumulates in increments. It is a lease signed in your own name. It is a savings account increasing steadily each month. It is 3 children going to sleep in their own beds in a home that you built from nothing. Waking up the next morning asking for pancakes with the complete confidence of children who have never once doubted that their home is permanent and their mother is capable, because you made sure they never had reason to doubt either of those things. Marcus has moved twice since the divorce was finalized. The relationship that ended our marriage lasted approximately 14 months after I found out about it. He takes the children on his designated weekends, and to his credit, he does show up consistently, which is more than I expected, and which I acknowledge without dwelling on it. We communicate about the children by text message. It is efficient and sufficient and requires nothing from me beyond the information directly relevant to their well-being. I have stopped waiting for an apology from my parents or from Vivienne. Not because I have decided they do not owe me one, they do, but because I have learned something in the past 18 months that I wish someone had told me years earlier. Waiting for an apology from someone who is not ready to give it is a form of staying attached to the version of your life that hurt you. And I am not interested in staying anywhere I had to beg for entry. Last month, Nora's school held a family showcase evening, the kind of event where children present projects and parents walk around, drinking weak coffee from folding tables and trying to read display boards from a distance. I went, obviously, the way I always go, the way I have always gone to every single thing. Nora's project was on the subject of resilience. She had spent 3 weeks researching it, the psychology of recovery, the documented factors that distinguish people who rebuild from people who stay buried under what has happened to them. She had made a display board by hand. At the bottom, in slightly smaller lettering than the rest, she had written a sentence that she told me was her own, not from any source she had found. It said that resilient people do not stand still waiting to be rescued. They identify the next available step and they take it. She was standing beside the board, watching me read it with that careful measuring look she has had since she was old enough to watch the world and draw her own conclusions from what she observed. She told me she had written that part herself. I looked at her for a moment, this daughter of mine, 10 years old, already understanding things that took me 34 years and a closed door and a garbage bag on a porch to begin to understand. I told her it was good. She said she knew. I do not tell this story because I want your sympathy. I am not in need of it. I have a functioning apartment with all drawers operational, a team lead position I earned through documented work, and 3 children who are loudly and specifically and wonderfully themselves. And I am genuinely, solidly fine. I tell it because I know there are people listening right now who are standing at some version of that door, who are holding everything, the children and the bags and the broken trust, and the weight of asking for help from people who are supposed to love them without condition. And the door is closing, and it feels like an ending. It is not an ending. I promise you it is not. It is the first moment of a story that has not yet shown you what it is going to become. The people who closed that door on me are living the same lives they were living 18 months ago. Same house, same routines, same radius. While I built something entirely new from a motel room and a garbage bag, and 3 words whispered to no one on a dark porch. There is no sweeter outcome than that. Not one. If someone told you there was no room for you, what did you do with that? Tell me in the comments. Because I believe the people listening to this understand something that took me far too long to learn. The people who say there is no space for you are usually just afraid of what you are going to become once you find your own.